Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to get started again. This is a 3D session. We've just split up into different rooms. So we're a little bit smaller, but that'll make for a more intimate conversation, I hope. I'm happy to introduce our chair for this panel is Professor Amy Wilson, who is in the KU Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Amy will lead our session just like the other ones, 10-minute presentations and 20-minute discussions of each paper.
Hi, everyone. I have been told that I need to keep time strictly. And you all have 10 minutes for your presentation. So I'm going to set a timer for 9 minutes. When it goes off, that means you have a minute to wrap things up. And so we're going to get started. The first paper is titled Traumatic Echoes, Afropolitan Experience in Darko's Beyond the Horizon and Adichie's Americanah. And this paper is by Bernice, Franklina, and Abolga from the Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Kansas. Are you ready?
Thanks, everyone.
Are you muted?
Thanks. Right, so
Thanks, everyone. I'm presenting on the traumatic echoes and Afropolitan experience in Darko's Beyond the Horizon and Adichie's Americanah. And so this is my outline. I have my introduction, synopsis, Afropolitanism, trauma theory, incidents of trauma, my findings and conclusions. Embedded. Beyond the Horizon is a novel written by the Ghanaian famous author Ama Ata Aidoo, and this novel opens up with a story about Myra, who, upon looking at reflection in a mirror, recall her experiences as a sex worker. Myra is given to Akobi in marriage at Nampa. Then they move to the city where her husband Akobi dominates over her. Akobi exhibits traits of toxic masculinity, whereby he belittles and then makes Myra feel inferior to him in this marriage. Further, Akobi leaves for Germany and sends an invitation to Myra to join him. Myra, upon reaching Germany, is transformed into a sex slave and a sex worker by the manipulations of Akobi, her husband. Myra finally fights back against her ex-husband, exposing his wicked schemes to his white wife, Gert, who divorced him, and later on, Akobi is imprisoned in Germany for his fraudulent ways of living. In Adichie's Americanah, her story centers around a central character by name Efemelu, a Nigerian woman who gets her hair braided in a preparation for her upcoming return to Nigeria. She interacts with the women there and remembers her past. She has broken up with her boyfriend, Blaine, closed a popular blog about race, and uprooted her life because she feels weighed down. Upon receiving an email from Efemelu, thus Efemelu's ex-lover, Obinzi becomes distracted, and finally Efemelu goes back to Nigeria and these two are reconciled. Adichie's Americanah talks about the experiences of Afropolitans who found themselves in a cosmopolitan space and who go through various forms of challenges that sort of alienate them from their culture or alienate them from their identity. So as Ama Ata Aidoo's Beyond the Horizon also uses talks about the patriarchal societies or norms that men take, which sort of leads to toxic masculinity identities in how they treat their wives. Here, I'm making reference to Myra or African immigrants or spouses who leaves the shores of Ghana to other parts of the world in a cosmopolitan area or space, trying to make a living for themselves. And this is what Mara also goes through. And so these two novels sort of try to reveal or reveals to we the audience about the traumatic experiences or the traumatic encounter or episodes that immigrants from Africa in a cosmopolitan space experience or goes through. I decided to pick this theory or this concept to help explain what I want to do, since it's an Afropolitan reading of the novels. So Afropolitan or Afropolitanism is a term referring to an African in a cosmopolitan world. It could be any part of the world. So I am an Afropolitan because I am a Ghanaian by citizen or by nationality, and I am here right now studying. So I am an Afropolitan because I'm in this space. So we could have US, UK, France, Germany, Norway, among others. It was first penned by Thais Selassie in her essay by Baba. And then Akili Mem also talks about how Afropolitan talks about someone who has a multiple identity. That's making the person a hybrid because you constitute multiple identities. And then we have Chimamanda herself, and we have Amada, who also sort of exhibits these traits of Afropolitan. Furthermore, Afropolitanism may create a new form of the role self through erasure, substitution, and repression. And this comes into place when characters or when people who leave the shores of Africa over to the cosmopolitan world are sort of able to adapt or try to erase their culture, trying to fit in a new space that they find themselves within. And so it may result in erasure of a person's identity, substitution where a person tries to pick up or adapt a new or foreign identity, and then recreation, trying to put these two together. And these are reflected in the work that in the novels that I'm presenting on. I'll talk about trauma theory in a nutshell, talking about it from Patikaru's unclaimed experience, where she talks about the present times, how trauma becomes a universal and how it is related in experience of what people go through. So she says trauma is contagious in its narration of shocking experiences to another. And from the beginning of the Beyond the Horizon, we see Mara sitting beside a mirror, reflecting upon her identity, reflecting upon who she is, talking about the things that she has gone through, those things that are so traumatic. That's from an episode of Myra's identity. And it talks about how one is able, or how one is alienated from culture. So we have this to think about. It gives a photographic image of the repressed memory that the victim tries to let go of, as is being reflected in both novels. And I have Efemelu having this recollection of how she is as an African and the need for her to go back to her root for her identity. So trauma victims can overcome their situations through self-consciousness and self-actualization. And this is where, in my novels, both characters, or both main characters, are able to sit and actually decide to fight or resist these challenges that they go through in the novels through self-consciousness and self-actualization. And these are the episodes of traumatic experiences that they go through. So immigrants coming from Africa find themselves in cosmopolitan areas are sometimes open up to these dangers that they find themselves in, that they have no way of turning back from. So I have commodification of sex, where sometimes because of the paperwork and all these challenges that immigrants go through, people for themselves as an Afropolitan in a cosmic space, for themselves engaging in sex trade as a form of way just to find a way of living within these geographic spaces. We can also make mention of domestic rape as also a form of trauma that people engage whilst away in a cosmic, in a cosmopolitan area. You can talk about language, and here Chimamanda uses her novel to show the dynamics that language plays as a very important cultural identity. We see characters like Efemelu and then Auntie Uju even hating or emphasizing and telling the son not to speak in the Nigerian local language. We see Efemelu trying to adapt a foreign accent so she can be, she can be take, she can feel comfortable as an American trying to exhibit such a foreign character. And then we have the paper union, which is marriage, where Afropolitans sometimes force themselves into forced marriages as a way of getting legal permit to stay within the US or any other part of the world. And then the last that I will mention is clothing, which talks about our hairstyles as a way of also embarking cultural identity. We can make mention of the Afro hair, the braids, as I have. We have dreadlocks, and in Adichie's Americanah, we realize characters trying to change their hairstyle just to find themselves belonging in the American society or the American system. In my findings, what I came up upon from this, should I say, comparative study of my novels, is there's a huge rate of cultural shifts from the African shifts to the cosmopolitan space. We have loss of identity, which is a very important landmark, which Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about with regards to the language accent. We have psychological effects of Africans who also comes here, and then as a result of they trying to find ways of means of making a living for themselves, they are able to, or they are forced into this psychological state or situation whereby they have no means of gaining their self-actualization or gaining their self-consciousness as a people. And then we have cultural alienation, and then some are displaced because they are unable to go back to their homes, because they did not have these legal permits that will enable them to go back to Ghana or to go back to any part of the world, as in the case of Myra, who do not have a legal passport to require a legal passport and a visa that will enable her to leave Germany back to Ghana to be with her family. So this is it. Thank you.
Minutes for questions and comments.
I can start if you want.
I think I might open it up to the.
I'll go. I would love to hear more about your choice to use trauma as a framework, especially because the kinds of harm, suffering, negative experience, adverse events, to use a Louise language earlier, are so diverse in this case. On the slide, we had rape. We had the commodification of sex, which I'd argue can be empowering or can be harmful. So like, it's not even necessarily negative. You narrated it as more like an involuntary thing, but I think we could use, I think you said they force themselves, which is already, so, okay, commodification of sex is somewhere else. But then you have the kind of more mundane work or the more mundane suffering of, language, accent, like microaggressions. And all of those I can definitely see under an umbrella of like negative experiences. But trauma is a really specific biomedical even, thinking about our other panels today, like mental health harm. And it's one that's not just adversity and might even be distinguished by the fact that like you can't just bounce back from trauma. Like trauma by definition is the scar, right? Is the psychological wound. And so I want to know more about why trauma to contain all of those negative things, and what putting them together is doing.
All right, Stacey, thanks for the question. So the reason why I decided to use trauma in analyzing these novels is because after reading Practical's trauma theory, I realized that Bailey also wrote something that's also in line with trauma, where she talks about the result of relatedness. So she talks about how a person is trying to explain or narrate how a traumatic experience may perhaps have happened to him or her. And in that state of narrating, the person is not able to narrate it because of the painful experience that perhaps he or she might have gone through. And so in the course of narrating, the person is unable to even recall from the cognitive, memory that he or she has about that experience. And that's why it is related. It takes time for the person to come back to it, to narrate or to open up about it. And in the case of Ama Ata Aidoo's Beyond the Horizon, I realized that perhaps Myra is an example fit for that sort of trauma, because she's unable at the beginning. She was even unable to recall that these are not normal experiences that a couple, a spouse have to go through. But it takes time, and later on she realizes that she's been subjected, okay, as a result of the husband, Apobi's toxic identity. So yeah, that he sort of mandated and then did to her. And so she was now trying to, gain herself, should I say, self-esteem back. And as a result of all these things that Akobi does to Myra in Germany, he sort of blackmail her into engaging in, sex trade, or she becomes a sex slave of the husband, where she doesn't even get the money that she's, using her body as an exchange for. It rather goes straight into the pocket of the husband. So yeah, we realized from the beginning of the novel, she's seated by the mirror, reflecting, talking about the scars she has on her body because of some of the sadistic clients that she has. She gains, she now sees herself as a caricature and not a full human being, perhaps. And that's why I felt like this sort of talks about that psychological effect trauma has on people, and that's why I use this theory to sort of explain the reasons of Myra as that. But in Adichie's Americanah, I felt it's also not really a high level of traumatic experience that someone might pose it. But then I felt it's also like a sad form of trauma that people go through here in a cosmopolitan area. One might not necessarily have a mental breakdown, but it takes time before one gets to such a state of breaking down in a cosmopolitan region.
Yeah, I just really like this portion of America where I just hope that I'm putting it right. Where the main character is Emily, is kind of forced. I really love the way you use the word forced to merchandise her body because she did not want to do it in that story. And Chimamanda really narrates that scene where she's been pushed to a corner and she had no choice because she had no other option. So how do you think of that as a traumatic experience?
Thanks for that, Vishwana. Thank you. So yeah, so talking about Etemelu being pushed into having sex with the white man is also a traumatic experience because after the deed was done, she realizes that she had sort of like discredited herself because she had a lover already, Obinze, in Nigeria, whom she was committed to. So now, upon being in the US and having that intimacy taking place, she felt she's not worthy. This is not what she has to do. Someone can say she felt like she's sorry, she's a prostitute, and perhaps she has sold or sold her image in order for her to get money so she could provide shelter for herself. And so that's alone. But she kept thinking about it, and she being in the bathroom, she kept rubbing and rubbing and rubbing herself just to make sure she clears that stain away from her body. But then it is a psychological thing, and so it will take time before she gets used to it. So yes, that's my view of that.
Maybe mine is more of like a clarity question. Do you think using cultural alienation is much kind of describes the concept of the way you're thinking about your study more than you using cultural assimilation?
Yeah. So these two are different concepts as you just made mention of. So cultural assimilation is like in a form of how we use the way like acculturation. So coming from Ghana, coming to being in the US, I try to get used to the system here. Okay, so I'm trying to assimilate into the US culture and system. But when I say cultural alienation, I'm talking about, okay, so now I'm here in the US. How do I go back to my home? And I'm talking about culture here in the sense of like language, naming, those traits that see or that portray someone as having a root or having a belonging to a communal unit. So now as an African, I'm here and I've changed my accent upon getting here like in 2 weeks or 3 weeks time. And I'm not trying to maintain my mother tongue. I feel embarrassed perhaps speaking in public. I want to be, I want to be, I want to have, I want to be seen as an equal person, as like someone who is already an American. And so me trying to have a slurring form like what everybody does in Americanah is a way of like cutting off my culture. And then we have characters in the story who even forces the children not to speak in their language, their mother tongue, but rather to speak in American language. And this is also another way of cutting off a people from a community. Okay, so we have now these people going back to their hometown and they are unable to even speak or communicate in their language, and that's a form of cultural alienation where one cuts off gradually. In the case of Myra, we realize she's even unable to go back to Ghana because of the state that she finds herself within. But then she usually sends things down home because of the kids she left behind and the family she left behind. So that's what I can be.
And this one is really building on the first question. That first question asked why trauma for reading these novels. I would ask the opposite, why these novels? How does that help to explicate, unpack, explain some of the ideas that you're interested in related to trauma theory?
Okay, thank you. I don't know why I choose the novels, but I will say I really love reading about women. And then I love to work on like oral history. So upon just getting the story about Ama Ata Aidoo, I read it once and I was very fascinated with what really happened there. Perhaps I might have also maybe witnessed, but I didn't know that they had a name for it, like male hegemony over women or anything of that sort. And reading Americanah also was an assignment, but it was in a different nutshell. But I realized upon chancing on the concept Afropolitan or Afropolitanism, I felt like I can talk about these two novels using the experiences of the characters in the book.
I was also interested, you talk a lot in your paper about the importance of narrative and storytelling. So perhaps there's a link between them somewhere in the importance of narrative and storytelling to trauma.
Yes. So one could say that, thank you, that's true. So one could say, Adichie herself is an Afropolitan. She's able to go to anywhere she is because of that mobility aspect also in Afropolitanism. And so perhaps I could say she using her novel Americanah was a way of narrating the experiences of Africans in these cosmic areas. Sorry, what did I keep saying first? Africans in these cosmopolitan areas of space and the challenges they face because of not perhaps having the right means of people who could direct or help them out. And coming back to it being trauma, I was just trying to talk about she herself, or even maybe now realizing that she will need help. She have to have self-consciousness about who she really is and what she really wants. Because after her studies in the US, she gained lots of experience. She had work, she was having money, she had a white boyfriend, she had all these, should I say, resources. But then she said no, she stopped all this and then she decided to go back to Nigeria so she can be reintegrated and then re-socialized back into her society as a member. And so I think that's why Adichie uses this a story in this novel to explain what's really happening to people outside Africa.
Does the main character is Ama Ata Aidoo?
Ama Ata Aidoo is the author for Beyond the Horizon.
Okay. What was the name of the main character? I apologize, I forgot.
Myra.
Myra. So in the novel, does Myra talk about, or does the author show any awareness of the fact, like for example, I'm an immigrant in the United States as well. And I think it was only recently I started asking myself, why did I have to move here? So why am I saying this? It's not about just a personal storytelling, egotistical, but I'm saying this analysis has has room to do a historicized analysis of there are people who are moving from across the world for a certain reason. And then once they move here, there's a lot of literature in particularly in Europe right now coming on acculturation. And one of the critiques which Glenn and I have been engaging in is that they're concerned about that people come here and let's get them to a culture. They call it acculturation science now. And in my perspective, they're just basically trying to get people to assimilate into the hegemony. And oftentimes, and these are re-education schools in Denmark, where people are forced to basically their religion and the ways of beings are pathologized, and they're told to adopt certain religious aspects of it. While I understand characters like Myra don't have to go through these institutionalized things, which force them to sit in a classroom, learn the language, learn the do's and don'ts in American society, but at the very same time, these things like the accent, like you said, the various food choices, and all of these. I wonder to what extent there's room in your analysis to introduce this aspect of racialization, which shows the African other as the backwards, and whereas it is this American way of being that is the true human. Yes.
Sorry, so if I get you want to know the reason why perhaps Myra engaged in such an act, I get that.
I'm not saying that I'm interested in knowing that, Myra. I'm making a suggestion that I think there is possibilities in your analyses, and maybe the author
Perhaps,
talked about that
Yeah,
in
thank you.
writing, yes.
yeah, I'll think about that. Thank you.
We have a comment related. I'll go after this. Uh, in processing what you said about trauma and all of, like I said it earlier, like the different violences or events that these books narrate, I'm struck by how many novels written by African women about women that migrate out involve a rape or other kind of sexual assault by a white character. And I haven't read, I've read Americanah, not the other one, so I don't have a particular literary analysis, but I do wonder how that trope, if it can be understood as a trope, represents other kinds of violation, maybe even of the more mundane sort that you narrated here. That an assault on the body is also, an assault and also a seduction in a way, right?
Yeah.
A seduction that can't be resisted. And so especially if it's not depicted as rape, but as something more complicated, that's an interesting pattern, and at least in the future.
Thanks, Prof. With regards to that, I think after reading the first book by Ama Ata Aidoo, I made contact with someone and I was told that it's something that's really happening in Germany about how most Ghanaians and Nigerians, let me use that way, Ghanaians and Nigerians, because that's what the reply I had. This is what most of them are facing over there. But I just don't have the means, to conduct a research. About
I've done some of that research, so we can just stop.
Thank you.
Yeah, Liz.
So yeah, speaking of the mundane, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the trauma of racism, particularly in the everyday acts, right? And a lot of these questions are, you think about it, like the accent, right? And how when you open your mouth and what happens, the microaggressions as well. That we talk about. And I've only read Adichie's work, but I wanted to just say a little bit more about that and how you see that connection to trauma.
So thank you. On the trauma of racism, I would say I myself might have experienced that here in the US. I was going to the classroom to teach, and with my accent, sometimes I feel like, am I in the wrong class, because you teach and the kids will keep staring at your face and they're like, what are you saying? Can you come again? And that sort of also sometimes informs me to change my way of talking so that I will be able to accommodate them as students and teach for them to understand or hear my language as an African coming from Ghana. So that alone, it's something that maybe perhaps if I get a chance, I could also look into it. And aside even my accent, clothing alone also comes into being. My hairstyle, either I have to always have an braids or like afro. Upon getting to the US, in the in New York, I was asked by someone because I had full locks. Are you coming from Africa? And then I was, I'm coming from Ghana. So just the hairstyle alone is also a way of, you know, should I say, believing me as a person or as a communal unit. So that's also.
I would just encourage you to think about it in terms of these works, right? And what's happening in Germany and in the US and how you might connect those little things, this sort of slow death of the reason. Thank you. Thank you.
I hate to curtail this good discussion, but I think it's time to move on to the second paper. Thank you. So the second paper, do we have Luana on Zoom? Yes.
Hi, can you guys see me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Great.
let me, okay. Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. Just a sec. I'm trying to see you guys while I'm presenting. So, hi guys, good afternoon. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I have a cold or something like that. But today I'm presenting just a little part of my dissertation. That's an ongoing work, of course, which is Female Self-Agency in Chimamanda Adichie's Narratives, Emancipatory Perspectives. This is the main thesis and the main dissertation, and I'll just present like what was I thinking about when I was thinking about self-agency. So first of all, these are my research questions. How are the self-agency trajectories of 6 Nigerian female protagonists described in narrative scenes from Chimamanda Adichie's novels or short stories? And what is the emancipatory potential of emblematic scenes from the narratives as motivators of counterpositioning to the subjugation of Black women in the contemporary post-colonial context? So these are my main questions, considering that I'm analyzing the main characters, the protagonists of 6 narratives from Chimamanda Adichie. All of these 6 protagonists are female, they're all women, and these are the works I decided to work with. So we have her 3 novels, Purple Hibiscus with Kambili, Half of a Yellow Sun with Luana, Americanah with Ifemelu, and then 3 short stories, Imitation, The Thing Around Your Neck, and The Headstrong Historian. So what I'm doing right now is I've obviously read the books and I took some scenes to analyze. At first I was thinking about, oh, okay, these characters are being objectified, they're being hypersexualized, they're suffering from sexism, from racism, but also I wanted to go one step ahead and see what are they doing with it? How are the characters reacting to it? So this would be those trajectories of self-agency. And to do that, first of all, I need to understand the different, I decided to draw between agency and self-agency. So first of all, I got agency from Baba, which would be the possibility of individual agency takes place when the displacement of colonial discourse occurs. So Baba says that it's a pulsional incident, the split-second movement, when the process of the subject's designation, its fixity, opens up beside it uncannily absents a supplementary space of contingency. The moment of the subject's individual emerges as an effect of the intersubjective and the return of the subject as agent. And then Baba goes on with, he also says, the problem of identity returns as a persistent questioning of the frame, the space of representation, where the image is confronted with its difference, if it's other. So there is this thing with the agency that there is a problem with identity when it's confronted with the difference, with the other. And then going to Spivak, she questions this possibility of agency from the point of view of the subaltern when she's writing when the subaltern speaks, when she details the sati, the ritual sati, which is a Hindu ritual where widowed women choose to climb the funeral pyre of their dead husband in an act of self-immolation. But Spivak, she questions whether if this is a choice or if they're doing that because society are making them, are inducing them to do that. And then Spivak ironizes the defense of this act of immolation, because people would say, oh, it's the free will of the women who, as a widow, chooses to die with her husband. And she will make fun of it, this free will. And in the ritual's guiding writings, women who choose to perform the ritual are described as having courage and strength for characters, and the ones that decide to not, they don't want to die, they would be punished and relegated to the lives of concubines and incarcerated wives. So to which point would this be agency? And then Spivak goes to say, even as it operates the most subtle general release from individual agency, the sanctioned suicide peculiar to woman draws its ideological strength by identifying individual agency with the supra-individual. Kill yourself on your husband pyre now, and you may kill your female body in the entire cycle of birth. So here she's talking about non-agents who act it out. And when I'm thinking about the word self-agency, I'm thinking about, is there a way, is there situations where women could actually have agency from them to them that's not made for them? So I selected some parts from the narratives that I'm working with to think about that and to analyze that. I'll show just a little bit of each. So in Purple Hibiscus, when Kambili says I love you to Father Amadi, because it was something that came from her, that she finally speaks up. She erased the dryness in my throat, and as we go into his car and I said I love you, this I would consider as an act of self-agency. Or in Half of a Yellow Sun, when Luana, after being cheated, decides to go to Kano, because if there was a place where she could think clearly, it was in Kano. And then in Kano, she talks to other women and she decides what to do from there. And of course, if anyone, if the people who read the novels know that these acts, they're not linear, they are things that will happen, and then something might make you decide another way around, but they're interesting scenes. In Americanah, when Ifemelu actually cheats on her white boyfriend, and I heard the discussion about like some relations, some problematic relations between white men and black women. And anyways, she was dating a white man and she cheats on him. And although it's a reproachable act, it has its meaning, and it has a kind of meaning of self-agency. And especially when she says, I took what I wanted. If I gave him anything, then it was incidental. And then in the short stories, we will have The Thing Around Your Neck, when Akuna leaves after being molested by her uncle. You left walking the long windy road. In The Headstrong Historian, from the beginning, when Mwamba decides that she wants to marry Obierica no matter what, she would run away from another man's house if she was not allowed to marry Obierica. And then I picked one special scene from Imitation for its power, especially because of this image, this relationship of the Black woman with her hair. And when she realizes she has been cheated and the woman is completely different from her, she goes to the mirror and she cuts her hair, and she picks up the scissors, the one she uses to cut Adana's ribbons. She pulls up clumps of hairs and cuts close to the scalp, leaving hair about the length of her thumbnail. She watches the hair float down. she cuts more, she weighs it further. So it's a powerful scene, and it's a scene that she's going completely against her husband in a small way, but I consider that would be an act of self-agency. And then mostly in a big part of my dissertation, I talk about Chimamanda as a contemporary writer, and about how she puts herself in the world, how she puts herself in this context where she's publishing in English, and she talks about how it's a very ambivalent role, and how she's writing about a place of scarce resources. She's telling stories that are setting recognizable places, and she realizes that her fiction becomes political, whether she intends it or not. But she doesn't believe in that role model place they're putting her, as she thinks that's rubbish. So that was just the beginning, so we can talk a little about that. I hope I can hear your opinions, sources, and thank you.
Can you hear us okay, Luana?
Oh, I'll get my headphones so I can hear a little better, because
There was a pause, so that wasn't you missing out on noise. If you can hear my voice now, then you're okay. Yeah, maybe the headphones would be useful.
Okay, can you hear me?
Still hear you, yes.
Oh, that's great. I can hear you great.
Oh, fantastic. All right, I have a question, which maybe has a similar structure to what I was asking Bernice about. Agency, you've theorized really clearly the material that you were citing. A strong, starting point for some of the questions that you raised. But the examples that we got, at least in this format, which is necessarily so contained and brief, curtailed, whatever, is all resistance agency in this case? Is agency necessarily, like, the format you gave us was more about a rejection or a freeing, like it's emancipatory in your title. So I guess maybe I'm just asking, can we go back to maybe even just one of those examples and talk about how the emancipatory effects of it are more than just someone doing something for herself? I like the theoretical framework that you provided a lot, and I just haven't been able to map it on to some of the cases that you're presenting.
So you want me to, I didn't get exactly your question, like if the self-agency situations that I'm analyzing, if they're all, I'm sorry.
Could you just pick one and show me what the emancipatory effect is? Like that applies the theory more directly, because I could easily read all these quotes and just be like, yeah, these are characters doing things. And you're
Yeah.
specific, and so I want to see that in the examples, and I think doing all 6 is too many, so just picking one to go into really helpful.
I can pick it, because actually this part will be my last chapter, which is the one I'm still working on. And of course, this will help me think about it. But for example, the headstrong historian is a piece that happens in the colonial era. And these acts of self-agency from Nwamba, they are emancipatory, and I mean that you can actually see in the future the results from it. So, for example, right at the beginning, this is a part, the headstrong historian. She would run away from any other man's house if she was not allowed to marry Obierica. So actually, this woman, after her husband dies, she will go on and actually decide for herself that she wants the help from the missionaries in that the colonial situation she lives, and then after that, she will get real close to her granddaughter. So all of these situations, the acts of self-agency that she has, and this is just one part. Again, I didn't do this analysis yet, so I'll probably get other parts from this short story, and then till it goes to how it's reflected on the history of her family.
Yeah, so maybe another way to ask this is, are there examples of this character deciding to do things that are not agency, that are not emancipatory? And then how do we know that this is the time it's emancipatory, or this is in this case it is?
Yes, that's a great question. I'd say it really comes from my interpretation of course, and I'll argue on that, but because I think I've even told you this is non-linear. Some acts I consider that they are emancipatory and some are not. So, for example, in Americanah, there's before that there are the situation where she also cuts her hair. She also decides to stop straightening it, which would be like the same as Nikem in imitation. But she didn't do that because of her. She didn't do that from a situation where I can argue, oh, okay, she decided that because of herself, because she wanted that. It was from a situation where her boyfriend said, oh, I don't want you to straighten your hair anymore. You're suffering too much. And then there is this validation from him, like, I like the way your hair looks right now. So it is a situation of interpretation and arguing on my interpretation.
Yeah, let me ask one more follow-up, and I appreciate everyone's patience as I try to get through my thoughts. I think that the example you've given is interesting, but it really juxtaposes a kind of social or like collective force with something that's true to the individual. So we know it's emancipatory because it's what she wants as an individual. And it's been a long time since I read Baba, but my understanding, and your quotes are really useful here, is what makes that emancipatory is kind of framed around the individual subject, but that's as a rejection of colonialism. Whereas I think some of the examples you're giving are just anything cultural is oppressive, anything collective, anything that's not true from the individual alone is being presented as self-agency. And you've even been using that self-agency, which I think is really interesting in the framework. And I don't know that that's what you're trying to do, but I think that's one way I could hear it, as being self versus collective, or internal versus external. And that would apply to indigenous cultures as well as the Afropolitanisms and everything else.
Yeah, actually, now that you told me, I will actually think about that, because I'm still struggling with, okay, what exactly I'm looking for and what I'm trying to do. So that's actually really interesting to think of this self against collective, and to go back on Baba and try to figure out how it works in my research.
We've got a question from Sophia on Zoom.
Hi, Luana. Thanks so much for this presentation. So I have a follow-up question to Stacy's questions, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see self-agency as being different or perhaps overlapping with the concept of resistance. And if you think that resistance is actually an adequate term to describe what these characters are doing, or if there's another term that might be proposed. And I'm thinking specifically of terms like refusal that have been used in, for example, Kayama Glover's work, in Maryse Condé's work. So I'm wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit, the distinction that you would draw between self-agency and resistance.
Thanks, Sophia. I really like these words, resistance and refusal. You've mentioned Maryse Condé, right? And who else? I'm sorry?
I'm thinking of Kayama Glover, who's a scholar of
Kayama.
Caribbean literature, who works mainly
Okay.
on women writing in the Caribbean.
like what I feel it would be the difference is because self-agency doesn't necessarily is a type of, let's say, resistance as going against something. For example, in some situations, they're not going against something. They're just deciding for themselves. They're just even if it's going with what's going on, but in a way of, okay, this is something that I am deciding. I am doing this for myself. And even in some situations, it's not something that's conscious, but I think resistance would be going against something. And this, although in a lot of the situations they are deciding something against something, I wouldn't say that in all of those. For example, in Purple Hibiscus, when Kimberly talks for herself, when she finally speaks up, it wouldn't be an act of resistance, but I consider an act of self-agency.
Thank you.
That's kind of the question from the historian. Are you seeing Adichie build upon the work of others? She seems very inspiring. I suspect she's inspired others, but was more backward thinking, in time. Like, are you seeing this as revolutionary? Maybe you can just speak to that if I'm being clear enough with my question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I actually didn't hear.
Can
If
you
I'm seeing the works.
Can you place her work within some kind of time frame in terms of her chronology? Is she building on the work of others? Are you seeing some themes resonate that you saw in the work of others, perhaps? I also think she's inspirational and surely has been inspiring others for maybe more recent work, but her work itself is quite recent in the grand scheme. So could you give a historical perspective at all to her work in relation to the work of other writers?
Oh, right. Well, talking in terms of literature, we have Abuchi Mecheta, who before her were talking about women in Nigeria. We have Bernardine Evaristo, who, although she is Nigerian British, she's been talking about the experience of Nigerian women. And of course, her work, especially the Headstrong Historian, dialogues a lot with Things Fall Apart. And she many times will talk about Chinua Achebe's work being basilar to her work. So talking in terms of literature, we have that. And then when talking in terms of theories, I've been working especially on the idea of her being located. She can be located in the intersection of feminism. So although Crenshaw is located in the US, I've been working, dialoguing with her works, and also with some African and Africans located in the US, theorists like Oyeyumi, like Nameka, like Ajayi Soyinka. So especially talking about this frame of being a woman, being Black, being Nigerian, being an immigrant in the contemporary context.
Yeah, so I should have been more clear that I meant in terms of thinking about self-agency and these themes that you've been sharing with us today.
Oh yeah, so yeah, again, this is
Right?
I'm sorry?
Nigerian author.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
I was thinking more broadly that might not necessarily be other Nigerian authors.
Mm.
Not necessarily even be an African author.
Yeah, talking about agency, this is and self-agency. This is the part where I I was actually really happy to participate on this workshop to get some ideas of what I can do with that, because this is exactly the part where, okay, this is what I'm doing now. This is what I'm investigating now. So apart from Baba and Spivak, the main name I found that is talking about agency in one of her works is Professor Ajayi Soyinka, but I'm still working on more basic knowledge and more of the basics on what I can get to work with that.
I heard perhaps in Luana's comment, a request if there are people in the room on Zoom who have suggestions for theorists to talk about agency, difference between agency and resistance. Is that correct, Luana?
Yes, that's what I want.
Are there any suggestions in the room?
Yeah, thanks, Luana, for the nice presentation. I wanted to draw your attention on this. You are saying self agency, but if you realize in the Americanah, before FMLU could actually, portray that act of self-agency, it was like other characters sort of, help there to initiate that agency into play. And the same that goes in for I think my other work that I talked about. So could it be that self-agency can come into play by other people's should I say effort, or is within the individual portraying that act exhibit, showing self-agency?
Yeah, I think not for other people's efforts, but it can happen for, because of what other people did or said. Yeah, I remember she meets her friend, and after that, that's when some things happen. The same way as an imitation, when Kim cuts her hair, it's because her husband cheated on her and her friend told her that. So I wouldn't say it was because of their efforts. The effort is all from the cam. The idea came from her, but it was instigated by something, I'd say.
I think it's about time for us to move on to the third presentation. Thank you, Luana.
Thank you.
So up next, we have Abisola Akinsiku. Do you have a presentation?
I'm going to share my screen.
Yes. Luana, can you mute yourself for us again? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for giving me to present it. And I just want to say that this is I'm at the very preliminary stage of this research, and I may have very little to say about it. But I'm just looking forward to your conclusions. All right. So I have titled this research. I have titled it. All right. So I've titled it The Politics of Death, Necropolitics in No-Violent Bulawayo's Believing Names. So in essence, I have the cover page of the book that I'm analyzing, and this is a very prominent text from Zimbabwe. And one of the things that stood out to me from reading Bulawayo's text is the idea of death, the idea of the human body, and the idea of state oppression, and how that functions in dilapidating, destroying, and reducing people. And now we're not just talking about the idea of edge of the West versus Africa. Now we're talking about Africa towards Africa. And I mean by the politics that is at play even in African countries, and how that impacts citizens of those states. All right. So my idea of necropolitics come majorly from Achille Mbembe, and this ideology explains that it's the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live or how some must die. It is very interesting that Achille Mbembe is not saying how they may die, but how they must die. And it shows that they have little or no agency in determining what happens to them if they live or they have to die. Necropolitics also, necropolitics therefore create death worlds or new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to living conditions. And I really am giving attention to living conditions because poverty could also be a form of necropolitics, right? Living conditions that confer upon them the status of the living dead. I love this metaphor that actually Mbembe brings into the conversation when he says it is possible for people to be living, but to also attain the status of the dead in the way that they are seen by the powers that be in that territory. It is a theory of the walking dead in which specific bodies are forced to remain in suspended states of being located somewhere between life and death. Mbembe provides a way of analyzing these contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death. And he utilizes examples of slavery, apartheid, and the colonization of Palestine and the figure of the suicide bombers to illustrate differing forms of necro power over the human body and how this reduces people to precarious life conditions. So I am working with the ideas of poverty, I'm working with the ideas of precarious life condition, I am working with the idea of the metaphor of people who are living, but who are dead. And that is why this picture that I got from the internet is very useful in what I am saying. Like this scarecrow is dressed up kind of, but of course, it attains the level of living, but it's dying. So in Mbembe's seminal work, he argues that the exercise of power in contemporary society is increasingly focused on the control of life and death. And therefore, he suggests that the state's ability to decide who lives and who dies has become a defining character of modern forms of governance. And that would then take me to another African scholar, another scholar who has contributed, and I would say that maybe Mbembe even leverages on the ideas that they share. And the main thing that I am bringing out of Mahmoud Madani is the fact that it provides a historical context to African rulership and the idea of politics, even on the continent, that the idea of colonization has colonial rule tapped into the authoritarian possibilities, whose legacies often persist even after independence. So he is arguing that the situation of things now, even in terms of politics, comes or can be traced back to the idea of colonialism itself. And this is an idea that even the likes of Frantz Fanon have also talked about, even in the theories that they share. So now I'm bringing it back to the text that I am working on. So I am selecting like 5 sites, 5 locations from We Need New Names. And the first one is the opening of the novel itself is the sight of a woman who hangs from a tree. Clearly, this woman has what do you call that when somebody kills themselves? Suicide, right? Yeah. And the children, and we see this woman who has committed suicide through the lens of children, because this story is actually written from the perspective of children, right? And it is so unforgettable that at first the children were surprised by the sight of this woman, but poverty reduced them to the point that they had to steal the red shoe of a woman hanging from a tree. Poverty. And then we look at the idea of necropolitics even in that context. Another very powerful point in that text that I'm linking to necropolitics is where the state wakes up one day and they say, we are destroying the whole of this location because we want to rebuild, we want to have maybe government offices there. And this also happened even in Graceland by Grace Abani, and this happens in Lagos. where people are just displaced, and this is a situation of internal displacement of people, because the government wakes up one day and they say, we are clearing everybody out of here because we want Lagos to look better, but you do not provide other ways of them resettling. And in that story, in We Need New News, a woman goes to the market, leaves a baby in the house, and by the time she comes back, the baby and all of the buildings have been destroyed. It was a very pathetic scene in that text. And I'm thinking of necropolitics in terms of that baby that got destroyed. Novayole Bulawayo really describes the scene and how that the baby has been reduced to flesh, something like paper or papyrus, right? And the movement of a living baby to a flattened skin. All of that is what I'm thinking about when it comes to necropolitics. There are other three characters that I would also love to look at, and one metaphor that shines throughout in the text. It is the idea of dry bones. There is a character in the text that is called Mother of Bones, and bone is being referred to consistently throughout the text. And I'm thinking of the idea of humans being reduced to bones. And she's even called Mother of Bones. And the way that she appears physically also shows the impoverished situation that she's in. And it all starts from the internal dislocation that the government itself in Zimbabwe initiates, which is not just a thing that happens in Zimbabwe alone. I've given an example of it happening even in the center of Lagos, of Nigeria, which is Lagos, right? So that's another example. And then there is also another character in that text that because this person is a migrant worker and they have to travel, then they return back home now deceased with HIV. And Novayole Bulawayo describes how HIV eats and destroys this person and reduces them to nothing. So all of these, the idea of fumbling with the idea of death and the destruction of the human body is what I am thinking about when I'm using necropolitics by actually Mbembe to read Novayole Bulawayo. And I'm trying to connect the dots between the state, the power of the state, and the human body, and how decisions made by the government and in politics actually translate to affect people, even in physical form, even to the point that they have no choice but to die. I think that's it. Thank you for listening.
So I'm so sorry. That was very fantastic, and I apologize if I'm breaking the decorum. So that lack of choice contrasts with the last presentation, which was about self-agency. And I'm wondering whether that choice of death symbolizes ontological death of the human, whether instead of real death, like the Afro-pessimist perspective of the only way escape from racism is the death of the human, something along those lines. Like Fanon talks about it, that the only way out of this misery is the death of the category of the human. And is that something, or maybe I'm reading too much into actual physical death?
I really like that idea, and I think I should note it, that it is not just physical death alone, but we could also think about the idea of necropolitics and death in that way that you mentioned it, not just physical death, but we could talk about
Like social death. Social death. Yeah, that's the Frank B. Wilderson III. He has a book called Afro-Pessimism. I think you like it. I think he wrote it in a personal memoir. Which is, but I think you like it.
Thank you so much for that suggestion.
I think one counterpart to that framework, again, really, like I should brush up on my theory every year before the grad research workshop. But so necropolitics comes from biopolitics, right? And biopolitics is a concept built around, I mean, we were talking about population earlier with Ridwan's presentation. And so you have, it's necessarily not just about an individual, it's necessarily about the collective and the treatment of this group. And so I don't think like there's a social death, I think, is often used to describe some kind of exclusion, like a rejection of a person from a group, but I think necropolitics is describing the recategorization of this whole population together.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's really powerful about the concept. And maybe necessarily implies an other, and maybe that's where an exclusion or a social death can be. But I think the examples that you gave really illustrated that idea of some may live and some must die. That the slum, the clearing of slums, like is a necessary, is an act of violence, and it's really different than the violence of neglect. And that's where I think, again, like thinking about this in terms of population, or like the inverse, the Walking Dead rather than the promoting life, is really important, because you mentioned being interested in poverty as an example of necropolitics. But so much of, I mean, I guess this is maybe where I'm gonna turn this into a question. When is poverty necropolitics? When can we identify the state doing active, like proactive, maybe, work, in the sort that we identified in the definition, apartheid, slavery, those kinds, as opposed to the mere violence of neglect, like, the withdrawal of the state or of state services or of all those other things. Because I think necropolitics can have something special, right? It's not just poverty where some people die. It's not automatically necropolitics unless they must die.
Yeah.
So where maybe in stories about poverty do you see that framework being strong?
Well, I don't know if I will be correct, and I do not want to be correct. I just want to learn. The way that I see it now, and that can change with time, is the way that converts into necropolitics in we need new names, is the fact that these people were living good where they were before, until the state came in and demolished their houses without warning. And then they moved from being average to completely poor. And Nova Bulawayo then helps us to see the conditions that they face in that first state of poverty, right? And for me, that is where necropolitics is involved, because it is the state. This state doesn't actually provide nothing for them in the first instance. They provide for themselves, and then the state comes in to destroy what they have built. And without even giving them, it is okay if the state wants to destroy a section of the city and rebuild it, but how do you resettle people? Do you do it properly so that they don't move from average to misery? It is when the state becomes complicit in impoverishing people that I think it has become necropolitical, because it is very political. And it doesn't care if they live with that. Yeah.
Or they care that they die. They must die.
Care that they die.
They must die.
They care that they die. That's true.
Can I build on that? And just, it's more of a thought and a question, but it was really making me, first of all, I loved your presentation, and I'm so happy I'm on your committee. That's gonna be a lot of fun. It made me think a lot about the Congo, and there's this, Michaela Wong has a book about the Congo, and she talks about society kind of being on low battery with your cell phone, the draining and the sucking. And so I'm going to play on what Cece was saying, because I feel like it's not just, doesn't have to necessarily be proactive, right? The neglect, I think, can be active, especially when it's almost generational. If you think about the years of Mobutu, and you also think about the years of Mugabe, especially the later years. So I just want to throw that into the whole situation to maybe play around with time here, as well as intent, whether it's overt or covert, and also just thinking about the better.
Thank you so much. I think I should read about the Novatry thing, and then also think about history in Zimbabwe and the politics in Zimbabwe and how that impacts on people's lives.
To build on that thought, I'm a political scientist, so my mind immediately goes to terrorism, immediately goes to Rwanda, immediately goes to Machete Season by Gene Hartsfield, and the violence that is perpetrated by Tutsis against Hutus, and vice versa. So I would encourage you to think about, other similar displacements, think about potential acts of terrorism, think about, there's recent work by Abolga, How Beautiful We Were,
I'll be in for the
which was a really great fictitious book about, the stereotypical African village being displaced, infected by oil, being displaced by poverty of Africa, by the blights, quote unquote, that affect African societies, from CNN, from other authors, not CNN being the media organization, of course, the Africa of CNN, the mythos of that. But the idea of necropolitics is really striking me because like there's obviously how does the state decide who lives, who dies? Is it the Hutus, is it the Tutsis, is it the terrorists, is it the Israelis, is it the Palestinians discussed, and as these contemporary political events are going on, I feel like there's a lot of that applicability to contemporary events. So I feel like there's rich areas to draw, not just in the Zimbabwean context, but also to look outside and the rest of the African diaspora, the rest of the Middle East, look at China, look at the Uyghurs. There's so many routes you can go with this. It's just exciting kind of proposition that you brought this to discussion, and wish you luck on so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate. Like, while you were talking, I then started thinking about the idea of terrorism in Nigeria, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, where we have people who kill people, who destroy villages, because they believe that they have some religious beliefs, and the way that the government of Nigeria is also complicit in that act. They are killing people by the day. What is the government doing? And then the recent president that we have had, the wife says, when people were complaining about kidnapping, the wife of the president says they should all be praying. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, we are in this real serious mess. How can the wife to the president of the country tell us to pray about kidnapping? What is the office of the president doing? And that also helps me see that necropolitics is not just a thing that is going on in novels. This is something that we can actually also relate to contemporary things that are going on even in the country. Thank you very much.
I'm going to add to that even what's going on in the East, because terrorism is maybe sometimes a more palpable or obvious example, but the kind of sanctioned violence of other organizations, and I mean sanctioned in kind of like a cheeky way, where it's being nearly institutionalized, and maybe this is like where neglect is proactive, in other ways that it's being just kind of cordoned off, but treated as somehow different.
I have a question, and so I haven't read the novel that you're talking about, but in your presentation, you talked quite a bit about the role of children, babies, and I was wondering if that's is that consistent in the novel? Is there an emphasis on the death of children? And if so, then is there a way that connects to the idea of necropolitics, and that it's not just a killing of the current generation, but also of future generations?
Wow, I love that question. And that takes me to a very pathetic example in the text. And I really love the way you framed the question as it is not just killing people who are here now, but even killing the future generation. Obviously, the all of We Need New Names is written completely from the perspective of children. And interestingly, the protagonist is called Bastard. And in the African context, there is a lot of meaning that can be read into that very evocative name that is given to the protagonist. But even beyond that, beyond the fact that Bastard is the main protagonist, and there are also other children there, maybe like 5 to 4 of them, who we also see things from their viewpoint. And it's interesting that these children actually have deep insight into things and they deconstruct things. And but I would say of an instance where we see one of those children impregnated by our grandfather, that's a grandpa. And there is a scene of the children using iron anger. That's the anger used to hang your clothes to remove the photos. And it reminds me of your idea takes me to that it is not only children who are on ground, this is necropolitics that is even affecting children who are even unborn, right? So I see it that way, but of course, I know that can be complicated in many ways, right? Yeah.
I think we have a question from Charlotte.
Oh, Charles.
So, can we say that the author uses this book to sort of, talk about, the depleting state or nature of Zimbabwe? Yeah, and then it says like an agency where it sort of tries to correct the system of its degradation by, as you rightly say, deconstructing these stereotypical, nature of the government's favor of maybe providing the needs of its people. Could we put it in that way also? Yeah, sort of. I was asking that, can we say the work serves as an agency of, correcting or trying to help correct, should I say, the system? Yeah, of that state. That this is the condition of the people, and the author is using the work to sort of find a right way of bringing the outcries of the public, of the living dead, to people for us to know about what is happening.
That's so true. Like, I feel like, even though I have never been in Zimbabwe, reading Novel Bulawayo, and maybe alongside even some Nigerian authors like Chris Abadi, helps me to see so many of the issues, some of the issues that people are facing in Africa, and how the state is also complicit in that experience. And people are.
Thank you. It's a nice question. Thank you.
I think in that way, it's a really strong counterpoint, as has been said, to the emphasis on agency. Like, I think my question in the previous presentation, like, what does not agency look like? And the view of necropolitics is like, what does it matter if you cut your hair, if your baby's dead, if like you've been bulldozed in this way? And so I think that to the extent that like necropolitics is the way to understand these stories, it's making an argument that our kind of individual like meaning making and resistance, all of these things are just futile in the context, like in a necropolitics context. Can you explain the title? We need new names.
I don't know. I don't want to pretend like I knew that. Well, I think it's just a name that, and even for the title of books, some authors don't have authority over what the title of the book becomes. It could be a publisher's decision, but I think it's a catchy way of criticizing maybe the political landscape, like we're actually doing a new name. And maybe that could also be connected to even Bulawayo herself, because she named herself. She renamed herself, right? So maybe it's a comment on we need to change things in this country. Yeah, I will pretend.
It seems to be a comment from someone who's not read the book at all about generation. Because your name is something you get from your family, and then in the story you have a bastard with the name bastard, and then you also have grandfathers impregnating their grand. So you have these kinds of like generational disruptions, and I could see one response to that being like, we need to realign the family. We need to fix what that is, but we need new names. To the extent that it represents the author's view, like is pointing to something about like a different direction.
Was the book written in English or is it a translation?
It's written in English.
Build on that a little bit more. It's teasing out that idea of realignment. That's just talking about, like, I'm thinking of Louis Bianco and his, whole thesis statement, / several English books about, the point of preserving indigenous language instead of writing in English, he decided to write Kikuyu, so. And I think that might be a perspective to bring in as well, as you go farther in this project, look at, counterpoints. Resistance is this seemingly futile effort of resistance, this seemingly bulldozing nature of states, as we emphasize English and Swahili in the given context, we don't keep Kikuyu as a language instruction, what people speak at home. There's so many indigenous African languages that are not taught in schools, and perhaps re-emphasizing that, reframing that as a key cultural touchstone, as key cultural piece would help bring people back in line with the state and the state back in line with the people. So perhaps this could avenue of research for you.